proposed Wairarapa Combined District Plan on Monday, the 16th of December. Topics that we will be covering today are the ecosystems and Indigenous biodiversity, the coastal environment, natural features and landscape, and natural character, and finally, public access. Kia ora tātou, ko Robin Jerry Campbell tuko ingoa, ko Tararua Timonga, ko Mangatarere Te Awa no Taratahi Aho, tēnā koutou katoa. I am the chairperson for this morning's, or today's and tomorrow's hearing stream 6. Before I ask the panel and everyone in the room to introduce themselves, I'd like to ask if we could all start today's hearings with our karakia timatanga, which is on the wall there if you'd like to join in. Mai iti paimona, raro ki te tai, mai iti awa tonga, raro ki te awa raki, te rei te hapuri, ati ai taratahi, whano, haere mai te toki, haumie, huie, tākia. So I think, Joe, could we start with you? Would like to introduce yourself, please?
Atamari whānau, ko Joe Hayes tōku ingoa. I'm the representative for Rangitane iwi. Kia ora.
Good morning, everybody. David McMahon. I'm a planning practitioner and independent commissioner based in Wellington.
Kia ora, everybody. I'm Brian Della, councillor, Carlton District Council.
Alistair Plymouth, councillor, South Wairarapa District Council.
Morning, Craig Bowyer.
Kia ora koutou, my name is Erica Wheatley. I'm a senior professional planner at Boffa acting on behalf of the Wairarapa councils, and I will be a reporting officer today.
My name is Matthew Golson. I'm a graduate planner at South Wairarapa District Council, and I'm the reporting officer for public access and natural character.
You're on the hearings administrator.
Yeah.
Kia ora, I'm Emma McRae. I'm a landscape architect from Boffa School. I'm supporting the combined councils with landscape advice.
Kia ora, Russell O'Leary, Group Manager, Planning and Regulatory, South Wairarapa District Council.
I'm Beth Skidis, Planning Coordinator, South Wide.
Sorry, Alice Balloon, planner at Marston District Council.
I'm Hamish Wesley, consultant to the Wairarapa councils.
And Morena Solitary Robertson, planning and regulatory manager, Carlton District Council.
Thank you. So this morning, the first part of our morning, we will be hearing from Erica Wheatley on ecosystems and Indigenous biodiversity. So hand over to you.
Cool. Thank you. As I said, my name is Erica Wheatley. I've prepared the Section 42A report for the ecosystems and Indigenous biodiversity topic. The statement will cover a brief overview of the chapter and the topic, matters raised in submissions, recommended amendments in response to the submissions, responses to pre-circulated expert evidence, and a summary of the key matters in contention for this chapter. As a quick note as well, Boffa School does provide policy advice to Transpower New Zealand who have submitted on this chapter. I've addressed those in the Section A report and in this statement, but where it says Solitaire Planning Manager at Carterton has addressed those points to avoid a conflict of interest. Yeah. Alrighty, kicking off. The purpose of the Ecosystems and Indigenous Biodiversity chapter is to manage activities and their effects on Indigenous biodiversity. Section 60 of the RMA states that the protection of areas of significant Indigenous vegetation and significant habitats of Indigenous fauna is a matter of national importance. In addition, the National Policy Statement for Indigenous Biodiversity, NPSIB for short, directs both district and regional councils to protect significant natural areas and maintain all Indigenous biodiversity in order to achieve no net loss. The NPSIB has recently come into effect in July 2023 and requires councils to implement its direction by no later than 4th of August 2031. However, the direction related to identifying significant national areas is required to be implemented by 4th of August 2028. However, I do note there have been some recent changes made to the RMA that meant identification of SNAs, significant national areas, do not apply for the next 3 years till 25th of October 2027. Change 1 to the Wellington RPS Regional Policy Statement also includes provisions that significantly strengthen direction to protect Indigenous biodiversity. The direction provided through Change 1 largely aligns with the NPSIB direction. Indigenous biodiversity chapter seeks to protect areas of significant Indigenous vegetation and significant habitats of Indigenous fauna, which are identified as significant national areas or SNAs. It seeks to maintain and enhance other Indigenous biodiversity values across the Wairarapa through a combination of regulatory and regulatory methods. The proposed district plan contains 77 SNAs, which have been carried over from the operative district plan. The chapter requires protection of these areas through rules that limit vegetation clearance within them under Eco R1, as those SNAs do not cover all potentially significant Indigenous biodiversity in the Wairarapa. A further general clearance rule, Eco R2, applies to modifying Indigenous vegetation throughout the Wairarapa. This requires resource consent where such modification is large scale and or modifies mature vegetation. The non-regulatory methods in the chapter include public awareness, such as including 49 recommended areas for protection, which are listed in Schedule 6 of the proposed plan. This is for information purposes and encourages and enables volunteer forms of protection, such as community initiatives and covenants. The chapter largely reflects the current direction of the operative district plan, which was drafted to give effect to section 6 of the RMA at the time. The provisions have been adapted to the formatting and requirements of the National Planning Standards. In addition, there have been minor and discrete changes to rules to permit certain appropriate activities, such as conservation and customary activities. There's also been an introduction of the effects management hierarchy that depicts how effects on significant Indigenous biodiversity must be managed. The status quo approach to this chapter, referring to largely carrying over the direction of the operative district plan, it represents an interim approach while the councils collect further information and undertake further process required in order to give effect to the NPSIB. To date, the provisions on the operative district plan have so far been effective and efficient in meeting the objectives to protect, maintain and restore Indigenous biodiversity across the Wairarapa. It is therefore unlikely that there will be any significant losses to Indigenous biodiversity will occur while this additional work is being undertaken. An overview of how the provisions of this chapter work together is included in Appendix 2 of the statement. Would you like me to jump to that?
Yes, please.
Cool. So Appendix 2 is on page 18. And what we can see here, I've divided it into two columns. So the first column is provisions that support protecting SLAs, and the second column is the provisions in the chapter that support maintenance, enhancement, and restoration across the Wairarapa more generally. So we can see we've got the objectives and the objective related to significant Indigenous vegetation habitat, Eco O2, for protecting SNAs. And Eco O1 applies generally across the Wairarapa to protect, maintain, enhance, and restore Indigenous biodiversity, and recognise and provide for relationships of tangata whenua and traditions. I won't go through all the policies that go under each.
Just hold there for a moment.
Can I just ask a question, please?
Yes.
These areas we're talking about, how many of these areas already have covenants on them through QE2 trusts or that sort of thing?
I'm not sure of the exact percentage, but what Eco R1 does seek to provide for areas that do have those sorts of covenants in place. It allows works to be undertaken in accordance with those covenants, but I'm not sure of the exact number.
Because that may well be quite a pertinent thing to this. If they already have protections, which I would say that a QE2 covenant on these is probably a higher protection than what we're doing in a district plan. Would that be a fair comment?
It will depend on the specific covenant, to be sure. But the other thing to keep in mind is these are operative, they are rolled over. There has been no change to these since they were included in the plan in 2009, 2010. And any future identification of SNAs may well take that sort of protection into account.
But to date, there haven't been
no changes to date.
Or with having rolled over, so maintaining that status quo.
Correct.
It's almost impossible to change a QE2 covenant, isn't it?
Theoretically.
Yeah, so.
If the current challenges to it remain robust, but yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, no, they are good. So jumping to the rules, because there are quite a lot of policies. The main rule for protecting Indigenous vegetation in SNAs is Eco R1. As mentioned, that provides for appropriate or necessary activities with no modification limits imposed. That includes things like maintenance in accordance with QE2 covenants and other such agreements. And there's restricted discretionary consent for trimming around electricity and telecommunication lines where the permitted activity standards are met. That's in line with the requirements of the MPS electricity transmission. And then defaults to discretionary consent where the permitted or restricted discretionary is not met.
So those rules, just for my clarification, are giving effect to higher order document.
Yes, they have also only had limited change in response to the current, let me rephrase. There's been limited changes to those for the proposed district plan, mainly because of the timing of the release of the MPSIB, but also because operative provisions have been so far working to date. It is seen as a relatively low risk to leave those in place until that further work can be undertaken. There was something else I was going to say, but it's now gone out of my head.
Sorry, Dan.
No.
I just wanted to.
Can I just take that? You just made a comment then that the current plans are working reasonably well. Obviously, we're going to hear from some submitters who say, well, they're not going far enough. Do we have any examples where the rules have been not been good enough to date?
The council officers, from the councils might have some salient examples. However, off the top of my head, there have only been 2 resource consents for clearance of Indigenous vegetation throughout the life of the operative district plan. Would anyone else like to provide any comment on that? So
only 2.
Only 2 consents over the
years.
Yeah.
I would say it's working.
I would say it's working quite well then, wouldn't it? Thank you.
Thanks, Erica.
No worries. I remembered the other thing I was going to say. It's kind of touched on in the introduction. There have been another couple of edits to this rule to allow for expressly permit certain activities such as around electricity lines or customary activities, conservation activities, for example. But those have been minor. In terms of the rules applying to protect Indigenous vegetation generally across the Wairarapa, we have Eco R2, which allows modification for the listed activities, which are relatively similar to the ones in Eco R1, but not identical. But it also applies a vegetation clearance limit via standard S1, which if any activity can comply with the standard S1, then it can be permitted under Eco Rule 2. It requires restricted discretionary consent for any activities where Eco S1 standards are exceeded, vegetation clearance. The other rule that protects Indigenous vegetation more generally is R3, keeping of goats, because they can escape quite easily and eat quite a lot of indigenous vegetation. So this relates to standard S2, which basically sets out the fencing requirements necessary to keep the goats contained within proximity of natural open space areas. Any other questions on the rules? Anyone panel on Appendix 2?
Just to follow up to an earlier question, has council done any state of the environment monitoring or monitoring of the effectiveness of this rule over the last 10 years, over and above acknowledging that there's been 2 resource consents? And has there been any need for any enforcement action, for example, where rules have been breached without a resource consent?
Not that I'm aware of. Did any of the council managers know of any? None? No.
And just in terms of Councillor Plummer's earlier question about the relationship between the identification, the rollover of the existing SNAs from the operative plan to the proposed plan, how difficult would it be to ascertain how many of those are subject to a covenant such as a QET covenant? Is that a large piece of work, or is it something that the council holds those records?
Could potentially. Do we know if council does hold those records, or I'm not sure we do, because that's it with the covenant itself.
Yeah.
We own land, a portion of within the
Yes.
ground land.
Yes.
So I'll know that's a question. But,
yes. The codicil to that question is how many QE2 covenants are there that are not covered by the rollover of the 44 SNAs?
Cool. So how many covenant areas are not covered?
So it's both sides.
Yeah.
Yeah. The reason I've asked that question is I'm assuming that a method to give effect to the policies in the plan and the higher order documents could be an SNA identification, or it could be some mechanism outside the district plan, such as covenant, so long as they are both effective and appropriate in providing protection.
Yes, absolutely. So to support that, you're quite right. We have, sorry, just scanning, the policies that are non-regulatory. We've got Eco P12 for creating conservation lots. Often the mechanism for doing that is via QE2 covenant. Eco P9 and P10 is support and encourage protection and restoration of natural habitats on private land and public awareness of natural values. So you're quite right, yes, those sorts of mechanisms outside the district plan, it can be very useful for achieving those things.
Thank you.
Can I just take that one step further as well? Since the operative district plan has been in place, how many, could we just perhaps get an indication of whether we've increased the size of our protected areas in the course of that operative plan?
Via QE2 covenants rather than SNAs, or?
Either.
Okay.
Either within the operative plan, has it had an effect of actually increasing our protections of areas, and as those areas increased reasonably significantly across the Wairarapa?
Cool. For the SNAs, I can probably answer that now. To my knowledge, the extents have not changed between the operative and proposed, but in terms of areas proposed by QE2 covenants, yeah, I'm not sure of that off the top of my head. I can find that out. Any other questions at this point? David?
Sorry.
No.
Yep. Thanks, Erica.
No worries. Alrighty. Jumping back to page 2 and section 3. There are a total of 22 original submissions and 12 further submissions received. As noted above and discussed more fully in section 6 of the statement, the PDP retains that status quo approach. due to the timing of the release of the NPSIB in relation to the proposed plan being prepared. Accordingly, many submitters have commented on the misalignment of provisions with the NPSIB, the Wellington RPS and change 1 to the RPS, and the higher order direction. The relief sought by submitters ranges from giving partial to full effect to these higher order directions. In terms of the evidence pre-circulated circulated expert received, I've read the evidence of Christina Schipper, who's a planner, and Graham Dennis Cock on behalf of, who is an ecologist, on behalf of the Director General of Conservation. Christine Foster, planner, and Jod Hudson, landscape, on behalf of East Limited. Matthews on Remo Bungie on behalf of Greater Wellington Regional Council. Emily Levinson on behalf of Horticulture New Zealand. Christine Foster on behalf of Meridian Energy. Chris Horn on behalf of Powerco. And Ainsley McLeod on behalf of Transpower. Turning first to the Director General of Conservation, Ms. Schipper has recommended that the definitions of biodiversity offset and biodiversity compensation and significant natural area be amended to align with the definitions of the NPSIB. I consider these are appropriate, particularly as I have recommended policy EcoP6 in effect be replaced with the effects management hierarchy from the NPSIB. So using the terminology that aligns with that makes sense. Environmental compensation is a definition in the plan that can now be deleted because EcoP6 has now been updated and no longer refers to environmental compensation. In terms of the policies, Ms. Schipper has supported policy P3 subject to the definition of significant natural area being updated, which I have recommended. Regarding the amendments sought to policy P4, I remain of the views expressed in my section 42A report that the amendments sought don't align with the purpose of the policy or its relationship to EcoP6, which is now the effects management hierarchy. Ms. Schipper and Mr. Lecoq have provided further evidence in support of deleting clause A of policy P7, which allows, it provides a policy pathway for allowing clearance of Tānuka, Mānuka and Tauhinu. Mr. Lecoq has described the importance of these vegetations at a national and regional level in terms of the habitat that they provide for Indigenous biodiversity. However, these species were identified as being particularly abundant in the Wairapa context and are not listed as being threatened on the New Zealand Threat Classification System. The provisions relating to these species are a carryover from the Operative District Plan, and there have been no identified issues with the loss of extent in these species under the Operative District Plan. A change in the status quo provisions that are likely to affect a wider proportion of the community should be socialised and consulted on at an earlier stage than hearings. And therefore, I recommend any such change should only occur as part of the future review if it's necessary at that time. Regarding the new eco policy that Ms. Schipper has sought to manage specified activities within SNAs, I consider this would have potentially large implications for the status quo approach, particularly as the SNAs currently in the plan are rolled over from the operative plan and therefore have not been identified in accordance with the NPSIB criteria or RPS change 1. The criteria and higher order direction is also potentially subject to change given the government's announcement it intends to amend how SNAs should be identified, assessed and managed in the NPSIB, which creates a very high degree of uncertainty. In addition, I don't consider there's scope to consider this additional policy as part of the original or further submission from the Director General, which gives rise to natural justice issues, so I do not recommend adopting this at this stage.
Thank you. So just to stop there, and my understanding with the NPSIB, because there are going to be more changes to it. The government have indicated that. For us to now consider giving effect to what it currently is, and if changes are then going to be made, we're still going to need to do a plan review in the future anyway.
Right.
And it's a little bit of crystal ball gazing about the levels that they, or do we have a fairly good handle on how they may change?
It is a bit crystal ball gazing is probably an accurate description. For example, sometimes when we've received an exposure draft of some MPSs, it's often changed quite drastically by the time it's notified. Again, we can anticipate that the provisions for identification will probably relax slightly under this government, but in terms of anticipating exactly what those parameters are would be guessing.
And hence the suggestion for the status quo until we are sure.
Yes, saving time and resources of doing rework.
Okay.
Yeah, could I just, from what you've just said, would it be fair to say that we would be on reasonably safe ground to say that given the operative plan is working, from what we've talked about before, that actually any changes to it largely not necessary given the uncertainty, given the effectiveness of the current plan?
Yes, yeah, there is limited risk in containing and maintaining the current holding pattern in the meantime until we're able to give effect to that, yes.
Do you think that's actually a justifiable position? Should we take that position and then it gets appealed?
I wouldn't be recommending it if it wasn't.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
I think another key thing to keep in mind there is the timeframes that we have to give effect to the NPSIB. It says as soon as reasonably practicable, which is subjective, obviously, and some people think that reasonably practicable time is now. But we do have those timeframes for, to give effect to them.
So we've got
2028 and 2031.
Yes, we've got time subject to when people consider it to be practicable.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's try and get it on record.
Just to,
Yes.
two from me. With giving effect to the NPSIB, I acknowledge that national direction only came out within 2 months of the plan being notified. So I guess most of the provisions were locked and loaded at that stage. There's two elements that we might need to consider. One is the spatial extent of SNAs, and you've indicated that there's been a 1-for-1 rollover of the existing ones with no change to boundaries.
Is my understanding.
Yeah, and that the criteria that are currently in the, well, do we know whether the criteria for identification and the MPS and in the regional policy statement would support those SNAs in terms of their current boundaries?
I couldn't say. What I can say is that those original SNAs have been identified in accordance with Section 6 of the RMA.
Yeah.
But as you'll be aware, the RPS came out in 2013, which is after the operative district plan came out, and then I expect it probably would, but no formal assessment has been undertaken.
Yes, and then the plan change 1 to the RPS. Does that capture any changes to the policy for identification and protection of Indigenous biodiversity?
Plan change 1 seeks to largely give effect to the NPSIB as it was notified. However, now that it's been signalled that that NPS is going to change, what that means for the direction of the RPS, I crystal ball gazing here, I expect there'll be limited changes to the RPS because there's no reason that you can't go beyond that. But we'll see.
Sure. Okay, well, that's the first sign. That's the spatial extent. So what about the policies and rules? I've been reading the legal submissions from the Director General, and they acknowledge points that you've made about giving effect to the NPS as soon as practical, and what what that means depends on the specific local context. They also acknowledge that the district proposed plan doesn't give full effect to the MPS and that it's not required to, and they're not actually suggesting that, but they're saying that there are some information gaps, such as in relation to clause 310, which requires 5 types of adverse effects to be avoided.
Yes.
And they're saying that, or the evidence of Ms. Sheeper, is that it would be appropriate at that their scope within the notified plan and submissions to address those policy gaps. What do you say to that?
Give me a second to just quickly look up 310.
310 subclause 2.
Yeah. I might have to get back to you on that one.
Okay, because we'll be hearing from Ms. Hartman.
No, later this afternoon.
Later.
1:45.
Would like to have a verbal response before we hear from.
Yeah, sure thing. I can do a bit of work in the lunch break.
Thank you.
And get a verbal response to you.
Thank you.
No worries.
That was all.
Thank you.
So moving on to point 25, introducing a maturity threshold for vegetation clearance, whānuka, mānuka and tauhenu and standard S1. I don't doubt the merits of doing that. However, I do question how easy this would be for your average person to apply in practice. The current provisions are this high and this thick around the trunk. So I'd be interested to hear from Mr. Lecoq or Ms. Schipper as to how that could be applied in practice. Regarding Ms. Schipper's statements regarding the likely existence of Indigenous biodiversity values and the recommended areas for protection, or RAP as I referred to them here, I consider that disapplying the Eco S1 to RAPs may significantly affect landowners who have not been consulted about the change to date, which therefore presents some natural justice issues. However, the alternative release she has sought, including a matter of discretion into Eco R2 as to whether the area is within an RAP, potentially has merit. The matters of discretion in Eco R2 currently refer back to policy, to the matters set out in policy P8, which includes reference to significance and values of vegetation and habitat and the effects and modification on the significance and values of the vegetation habitat, including potential cumulative effects. This currently enables councils to consider the effects of vegetation modification on a RAP and their significance and values. As such, I don't consider any amendments are required to give effect to this relief, other than potentially to be more explicit about the consideration.
I've got a couple of questions about this, Ms. Wheatley. To start with, just so that I'm understanding, what are RAPs?
So recommended areas for protection. They are areas, sorry, I'm going to actually find something to read so I'm not, I'm actually being accurate about that. All right, here we go. Recommended areas for protection are areas that have not been formally assessed against the significance criteria of the RPS and are therefore not identified as SNAs, but they were identified as containing Indigenous biodiversity values of significance by DOC. The RAPs have been included to assist in management of land use activities to achieve objectives and policies in the eco chapter. you go.
Where do they sit? So they've been identified by the Department of Conservation.
Correct.
They're not SNAs.
Correct.
They may have pockets of indigenous vegetation or other biodiversity.
Yes.
Okay. What framework were they identified under?
That will probably be a question for Doc. I believe Mr. Lecoq's evidence speaks to how the RAPs were identified.
And when they were identified?
Yes, I think it was 2000. It was 2010 potentially from memory.
Are there any RAPs that are SNAs?
Not to my knowledge.
And so effectively, what's the submission seeking to do? Is it not seeking to make RAPs SNAs, is it?
No, it's what
Applying a policy and rule framework to them.
Yeah, it's what they're seeking to do is so Eco S1 allows vegetation clearance up to certain thresholds. What the Department of Conservation are wanting is to not allow any activity to clear that sort of threshold, and only to allow for the activities that are listed in R2 to be undertaken.
So to apply the rules of R1, R2, Standard 1 to the RAPs, which sit outside the district plan.
Yes.
On a list maintained by the Department of Conservation.
Yes. Yes, that's effectively my understanding.
Yes. So one of the things that this panel is going to have to address when they consider that matter, and we'll have the benefit of the evidence from the department, is what's the more appropriate way of doing this? Is it one hand to identify these as SNAs? Is it to apply the rules to the ROPs that apply outside the plan? Or is it to apply a vegetation clearance rule generally to all land that's not identified as SNA, which I think is what the proposed plans to do.
Yeah, that's correct.
Has your section 32A assessed those three options and the costs and benefits and risks associated with those three?
Not explicitly, although I would need to check my 42A report to be specific.
Yeah. We may invite you to do that after you've had the benefit of hearing the evidence from the department.
Cool.
And just to see that whether you still believe that middle option, if you like, is still the most appropriate.
Yes.
Presumably that's your current view.
Yes, that is my current view, mostly because work has not been undertaken by the district councils to identify those as SNAs.
Yes, although presumably the department will tell us that the work has been undertaken to identify the RAPs.
Yes.
And we need to understand how robust that work is.
Yes.
Yes. And whether the policy and rule framework is able to apply to those.
Correct.
Is there scope? Does the Director General's submission specifically seek that relief in the original submission as opposed to an evidence?
Let me just check.
You can come back to us on that if you'd like. But presumably if we got to this stage, there must be some form of scope.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
I just ask follow on from that, the RAPs, has any consultation on the identification of these areas being done with landowners?
Consultation has been undertaken, I believe, as part of their original scoping, though the department will need to confirm that. But they are carried over, I believe, from the operative district plan. So they were included and consulted on as that stage, so they shouldn't be anything new. And they've also had the consultation period through this process.
They made the comment that in your statement here that the issue of natural justice, if we were to change the rules around it and the issue of natural justice. So how does that tally up with what you just said then?
So what I mean by that is, so currently the recommended areas for protection are an information and advisory sort of map layer. It identifies where values may be present. The operative district plan allows clearance up to certain thresholds, which have been reflected through standard S1. So to then, at this point, change the rule framework so that you can no longer undertake those clearance provisions under S1 in those areas would be quite a substantial change to those landowners who have RAPs on their land.
I think for me, one of the things about this plan is that it's quite quite specific. It says there are, it doesn't use maybes, it uses are, and it doesn't use the word may, because that's not a definitive answer. It's somewhere down the future we might define it. And for me, the plan is important because it actually has those very strict rules. This is or this is not. Anything that says may or could be or whatever has no place in this plan as far as from my perspective, because this plan is about what I can and can't do, not what I might be able to do.
Yes, and as I mentioned, like this at this stage, a non-regulatory layer where those sort of non-regulatory policies like voluntary protection or voluntary restoration, it kind of identifies where those non-regulatory methods might be more effective rather than the plan.
I think maybe I've misunderstood an element based on this conversation now. So can I just take you to paragraph 26 of your summary? First couple of sentences. And Doc's request that, well, we say, I consider that disapplying Eco 1 to RAP basically affect landowners. What does disapplying Eco S1, what does that mean?
So currently, RAPs would just be covered by the general vegetation modification rule, Eco R2, which applies district-wide. Currently, Eco R2 allows any activity to clear up to, let me just double check, clear up to 200 square metres for a single record or title, or 10% of the total area, if the vegetation is less than 4 metres high and trunk diameter is less than 30 centimetres. So currently you can undertake that level of clearance within RAPs. What DOC is seeking to do is not allow clearance under S1 to be undertaken within RAPs.
Okay, so that would indicate, I mean, this is where I misunderstood, that RAPs are actually scheduled in the proposed plan.
Yes, they are in the schedule.
Okay, I thought.
As an informational.
Are they part of the district plan, proposed district plan?
They don't have any rules applying to them. It's just in.
There's a list of them in the district plan.
But there's a list where they potentially, yeah. In Schedule 6.
Okay. And R2, Eco R2.
Yeah.
Does apply to them.
Yeah.
But not R1.
Not R1, which only applies to SNA.
Just to add that for Eco R2 applies to all land anyway, doesn't it? Yes. It's not specific to these. It's just
correct.
Anything that's not identified as an SNA.
So it's modification of Indigenous vegetation outside of a significant natural area.
So it's just intended to capture those instances where there might be significant clearance.
Thank you for that clarification.
No worries.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Alrighty. I think that's everything for DOC. So moving on to Eastleigh. Ms. Foster requested a minor change to policy P7, so Indigenous in front of vegetation, to just clarify that that's what the policy applies to. That makes perfect sense, or aligns with the focus and language of the NPSIB. Again, with the definitions of biodiversity officer education, I do recommend that these be aligned with the NPSIB definitions as noted before. I also note that there is scope to consider this, which Ms. Foster just put question in her expert evidence. Moving on to Genesis Energy, Mr. Matthews continues to seek changes to policy 5 and I originally recommended rejecting the relief sought via my Section 42A report, as I was not aware of any renewable electricity generation activities currently located in or near areas of significance that would require such policy support. In addition, I anticipated the future review of this chapter was required to identify areas of significance and then determine what measures would be necessary to protect Indigenous biodiversity values. And also reconcile the enabling direction for renewables and electricity transmission. Mr. Matthews considers the amendments he's seeking are appropriate on the basis it would enable maintenance and mine upgrades of future renewable electricity generation projects that may be located within or in proximity to areas of significance. He considers the future review is not sufficient reason to justify postponing such an amendment given the exemptions in the NPSIB, which is set out in part 1.33. In relation to policy P6, he seeks that there be an amendment noting that nothing in Eco P6, which is the effects management hierarchy, applies to development, operation, maintenance, or upgrade of renewable electricity generation or electricity transmission network activities. He considers this amendment will remedy the inconsistency between the plan and the NPSIB, which provides specific exclusions for these activities. It also will enable the development, operation, maintenance, or upgrade of renewable electricity generation without needing to wait for the future review of the chapter. The issue that this exemption raises is that there's no other policy direction for managing the effects of renewable electricity generation or electricity transmission activities within SNAs. This creates a policy gap for decision makers about how the activity will achieve the objectives of the chapter, i.e. that Indigenous biodiversity is maintained, enhanced, restored with no overall net loss. This gap is in part created a little bit by the NPSIB. However, to plug this gap, there would need to be a specific policy to manage the effects of renewable electricity generation and electricity transmission activities. An example of where this has been done is clause 2 of policy 24D of change 1 to the Wellington RPS, quite a mouthful. However, I do note that this policy is currently under appeal. Ms. Foster, on behalf of Meridian Energy, has provided a copy of this policy in her evidence. To summarise, policy 24D of the RPS enables nationally and regionally significant renewable electricity generation activities with a functional and operational need to locate in areas with significant Indigenous biodiversity values, provided effects are managed as set out in the policy. The effects management regime in the policy is similar to the effects management hierarchy, of which refers to avoiding, minimising, remedying and offsetting and compensating where practicable adverse effects, with the exception that it allows activities to proceed where residual adverse effects are not significant and the benefits of the activity outweigh residual adverse effects. So that's not applicable for the effects management hierarchy for other activities. Ms. Foster provides some context around the development of this policy. She comments that a zero intervention policy, as provided by the exemptions in Part 133 of the NPSIB, was always intended to be complemented by an updated NPS renewable electricity generation and an NPS electricity transmission that would set requirements for managing effects from renewable generation and electricity transmission activities. However, these activities can't be managed in the same way as other activities given the exemptions in the NPSIB. For the Wellington RPS process, policy 24D was developed, although under appeal, as I noted before. She seeks that a similar bespoke approach to managing the effects of renewable generation is developed that affects the avoid, remedy, mitigate approach of the RMA and the enabling approach the government has signalled for these activities. This is similar to the approach sought by Ms McLeod on behalf of Transpower, which seeks a bespoke managing effects of the National Grid policy in the network utility chapter that would apply across the overlay chapters such as the ecosystems and indigenous biodiversity chapter, coastal environment, etc. This would be a clear and concise way to give effect to the MPS electricity transmission. Accordingly, I recommend that the new policies be inserted into the plan to manage the effects of renewable generation and electricity transmission on natural values protected by these overlay chapters. This could either be inserted into the overlay chapters themselves, such as the eco chapter, coastal environment, etc., or it could be inserted into the energy and the network utility chapters for renewables and transmission activities, respectively. Given policy 24D of the RPS is currently under appeal and the new MPS renewable generation and MPS electricity transmission are not available yet, I'd be interested in working with Mr. Matthews from Genesis, Ms. Foster from Meridian, and Ms. McLeod from Transpower to develop specific wording of these provisions and determine where they should sit.
Thank you. But we'll stop there, and I know there's going to be questions.
Okay. Yeah, I like this idea of getting together with them. But are we likely to see, if you come up with a new policy, a challenge from DOC or Fish and Game or whatever they call it, so bird?
Difficult to anticipate, but at the same time, the MPSIB carves out exemptions for these activities from the effects management hierarchy. This particular policy would reimpose a different way of managing effects that I think would kind of goes above and beyond what the MPSIB currently provides as almost a blanket exemption. So I think this manages effects more than the MPSIB currently does.
Would it be worth having DOC involved in your discussions with the electricity sector?
Possibly, we could ask them.
Otherwise we end up going around in circles, because they would then challenge it, wouldn't they, if they're not comfortable?
Possibly. I think it would be worth asking DOC and potentially the renewables and the transmission submitters as to their views on that, because I expect they will have a view on who should be in the room.
They would have a view, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I'm intrigued by this too. Would that conferencing be largely mechanical, or would it be substantive? Is it because you talked about how and where policy, and you said you actually said I recommend that new policies be inserted to manage the effects of electricity transmission and REG, but I got the impression it was the wording and where they should sit in the plan.
Yeah, so I think that's the question. What I meant by that was whether it should sit in the overlay chapters, where it will be likely replicated a few different times for both renewable and transmission, because they might have a single policy or it might be two separate ones, or whether it's tidier to just have one in the energy chapter, one in the network utilities chapter, and that just applies across everything.
Right. So that's the mechanical component. The substantive component might be the extent to which these carve-outs are extended. Are they limited to REG, ET type matters, or do they go further?
Yes, that's a good point. So yes, what exactly the wording is around that, and whether particular carve-outs might need to be for specified infrastructure in the MPSIB as well. They have some carve-outs too. Yes.
So if they've lodged submissions, presumably Greater Wellington and the Department of Conservation would need to be involved.
Yes, I'd expect so, and particularly with the appeals around policy 24D.
Yes. Okay. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. On to the Greater Wellington Regional Council. Ms Bangi seeks the word of Eco 03 be strengthened and aligned with Objective 16B of the RPS. So this relates to the objective I've recommended inserting around recognising tangata whenua values and relationships and traditions with Indigenous biodiversity. I'm not opposed to the amendments sought, particularly as they align with the direction of the Wellington RPS. However, I note that Greater Wellington was the furthest submitter on this point, and the original submitter, Māori trustee, and the other further submitters, Rangitaneo Wairarapa and Te Tini o Ngāti Kahukura Whitia Trust, may have a view about whether this wording should change or not.
You do say that you don't recommend any amendments prior to hearing from these submitters. I
think
Māori trustee is submitting tomorrow. But I don't believe.
I don't think they are.
Rangatane or Ngāti Kahukura submitting. So will you be open to having a conversation?
Yes, certainly depending on what Māori trustee has to say tomorrow, whether they're opposed. But yeah, if discussions are to take place, I would probably want them to be in the room as well.
Because I personally think that it ought not to be just reliant on the Māori trustee. I think it needs to be with our hapu and our iwi that have submitted as part of the Wairarapa. So
yeah,
I would like to see that they are definitely involved in discussions around this.
Totally agreed.
David, did you?
I just wondered, in terms of Eco 03 and the red line version, just can you just what's that? Whose relief is that giving effect to?
So that was specific wording sought by a Māori trustee.
Okay.
However, Rangitaneo Wairarapa and Te Tini o Ngāti Kahukura Whitia Trust submitted more general submissions that about tangata whenua, hapu, whānau and iwi leading or engaging with ecosystems and Indigenous biodiversity work, but no specific wording. So I put that objective in to give relief to all of those submitters. Hence why I think they should be involved in deciding whether that is sufficient to give effect to the relief sought.
Yes. So what's the position of GWRC as per your paragraph 43?
So paragraph 43, the position of Greater Wellington at this stage is to change the objective as shown above under 42.
So that, okay, I see. And that differs from on the red line version. I see. But were they was that through a submission from GWRC or a further submission?
That's through a further submission on Māori trustees.
Yep.
Yeah, hence.
So was there any scope?
Potentially through the further submission, but hence why I think it would be very dependent on whether Māori trustee and Rangitaneo and Ngāti Kahukura Whitia are okay with that or not.
It's very conscious that further submissions can't seek relief. They can only support or oppose the initial submission. So to add new wording in might create a fairness issue.
Yeah, totally.
Cool.
Cool. So moving on to paragraph 45. Ms Bangi notes the recommended amendments to policy P5 enable minor upgrade of all network utilities, which goes beyond the original intention to enable minor upgrade of renewable electricity generation and electricity transmission activities only. She seeks this amendment as reversed and instead a new clause be inserted to enable maintenance and minor upgrade of renewable generation and electricity transmission activities only. I agree that this amendment appropriately focuses the policy to enable activities in line with the NPS ET MPS REG and exemptions in the MPSIB. In terms of the other amendments she sought to policy P5, from avoid or minimise to the activity is of a scale and nature that will maintain Indigenous biodiversity. I don't consider this as practicable, as any scale of vegetation modification is likely to contravene such policy direction. I understand the concerns raised about minimising effects on Indigenous biodiversity being potentially subjective and is preferred by applicants over avoiding effects, which is a higher threshold. A potential solution to this would be to rephrase the chapeau of the policy to add where practicable, which is shown under 46 there.
Any questions?
In terms of deleting reference to enabling fence lines and fire breaks from policy P5, I consider these appropriate activities to occur within an SNA as they are enabled through Rule R1. R1 also limits vegetation clearance to the extent necessary to avoid it interfering with existing fence lines and to erect fences around SNAs. If fences are not for this purpose, it then reverts to a restricted discretionary activity. I consider these circumstances are appropriate. In relation to fire breaks, I don't consider it's practical to set vegetation modification limits for fire breaks. Regarding the comments and amendments sought to policies P6, P7 and P8, I recognise and agree with Ms Vangi's comments that further work needs to be done to fully give effect to the direction of the MPSIB and the Wellington RPS Change 1. However, I consider these changes would substantially overhaul the status quo approach. I note that the provisions of the operative plan that form the basis of the proposed approach have been effective in managing Indigenous biodiversity values so far, so there's limited risk in continuing with these until the future review is undertaken. I also remain of the views expressed in my Section 42A report and do not recommend any additional changes to R1 or R2. Again, we've got the definitions of biodiversity compensation and biodiversity offset aligning with the MPSIB definitions, which I agree with. Regarding the definition of pest plant species and Appendix Eco 1, which is pest plant species, I still consider a district plan needs to be self-contained insofar as possible to provide as much certainty for plan users as possible. I don't consider it appropriate to refer to outside sources for this list of pest plants, as it's subject to change over time and does not achieve self-containment or certainty for plan users. This would also be a document incorporated by reference into the plan, which therefore introduces potential scope issues, including at this stage. While the list is derived from the Wellington Regional Pest Management Plan, because it is self-contained in Appendix Eco 1, it does not update whenever the original list is updated, as this would require a Schedule 1 plan change process. However, I note in Ms Bangi's evidence that Greater Wellington's Senior Biosecurity Advisor has mentioned the list does not include 17 pest plants that are in exclusion, eradication, progressive control, sustained control, or site-led programs, or 2 pest plant species that are of specific concern in the Wairarapa, being yellow bristlegrass and thornapple. I'd consider adding these to Appendix Eco 1 if a full list of plants for inclusion is provided. Ms Bangi also seeks the definition of SNAs be amended as shown in under paragraph 54. As discussed previously, the Director General Conservation has sought an amendment similar in effect, but with different wording I consider as clearer. Therefore, I recommend definition be amended as set out in section 4.1.
Just interested in the pest species issue. Is there any potential duplication between what the plan might be seeking to achieve and what the biosecurity legislation would achieve?
Unsure. I suspect potentially not. I suspect biosecurity, Horticulture New Zealand might have a view on this as well. They have some submissions on biosecurity provisions, but not to my knowledge.
I mean, for example, if the appendix Echo 1 is not amended, what other controls would there be on those 17 plant species? There obviously wouldn't be any control on the district plan.
No.
What's the risk of not including them? I guess that's what I'm getting at. Is there a risk? Is there another mechanism to ensure that those plant species are controlled, excluded, eradicated?
It would depend where they are. So if they are listed as an unwanted organism under the Biosecurity Act, which to my understanding, the minister can update themselves, then it can be cleared as a right under Eco R2 if it is a biosecurity risk under the Biosecurity Act.
Okay. What's the function of Appendix Echo 1? What rules are tied to?
It's tied to Eco R2, and it is clause.
And R2, just remind me, R2 is everything outside
District wide.
Hey?
Yeah. All right, let me just check. Yes. So Eco P5 provides a policy pathway for removal of pest plant species. Eco R1, which applies in SNAs, allows clearance of pest plant species.
Okay. Okay, so inside an SNA.
Yeah, which doesn't have a general clearance threshold standard that applies to it.
Yes, so you've got to be on the list.
Yeah.
To be able to be cleared in an SNA. Correct. As a permitted activity.
Yes. Eco R1 also does enable removal of unwanted organisms under the Biosecurity Act as well.
Is that term defined?
It's defined by the Biosecurity Act.
So that's 1A9.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
On to section 4.5 and Horticulture New Zealand. I note the errors Ms. Levinson has identified between the recommended changes to policies P1 and P3 in the 42A report versus the track changes version, so I have corrected those. With respect to her comments on biosecurity matters, I remain of the view expressed in my section 42A report that managing biosecurity matters falls outside the ambit of district councils as set out in section 31 of the RMA. However, I don't consider this as a matter that should be addressed via objectives and policies in the plan. However, the district plan does have a role in enabling other agencies such as Ministry of Primary Industries via other legislation, such as the Biosecurity Act, to undertake their statutory responsibilities. The plan permits vegetation clearance for the purposes of removing vegetation infected by unwanted organisms under the Biosecurity Act under both R1 and R2, with no clearance limits imposed. There are no wholesale earthwork limits in the proposed plan, as it was considered that the regional plan already sufficiently manages this issue. Accordingly, I don't consider there's any amendments required to enable necessary biosecurity measures to be undertaken, as the plan already enables this. With respect to the amendments sought to policy P5 to enable maintenance of primary production activities, etc., existing primary production activities can continue to operate under the existing use rights, which are in section 10 of the RMA. Rule R1 specifically permits vegetation trimming to maintain buildings, structures, fence lines, existing roads, and access tracks. R2 permits vegetation modification for operation, maintenance, repair of pasture, fences, drains, structures, roads, and tracks. Accordingly, I do not consider any amendments are necessary to enable existing primary production activities to continue. Comfortable with that? Oh, on to Meridian, section 4.6. As discussed under the relief sought by Genesis Energy previously, Ms Foster contends that policies P4 and P6 conflict with the exemptions for renewable electricity generation in the NPSIB. She considers the potential conflicts created by the PDP provisions need to be addressed and reconciled as best possible given the clear NPSIB direction. Ms Foster considers the wording of P4 needs to be amended to provide for the renewable generation exemption under the NPSIB. As mentioned, she's provided the example of policy 24D in the RPS that could achieve this. As discussed previously, I agree this change gives effect to the NPSIB, but also recommend that new policies be inserted in the plan to manage the effects of renewable electricity generation and electricity transmission activities on natural values protected by the overlay chapters. With regard to policy P5, Ms Foster has supported the recommended amendments in the 42-hour report as they align with higher order RMA and MPS direction when applied to renewable electricity generation. As discussed in 4.3 above, I've recommended amending the policy to provide for maintenance and minor upgrading and maintenance for existing access tracks for renewable electricity generation activities more effectively. Ms Foster has requested minor wording amendments to policy P7, again inserting Indigenous in front of vegetation to clarify what the policy applies to, and correction to renewable electricity rather than renewable energy generation, and also refer to assets and activities. I agree with inserting the term Indigenous, however, I do not recommend including assets as the definitions in the proposed plan only refer to activities. Then we're on to definitions again, which includes biodiversity offset, biodiversity compensation, and the consequential deletion of environmental compensation. Again, I recommend that these be aligned with the definitions of the NPSIB. Under section 4.7 for PowerCo, Mr Horn seeks an insertion of an additional clause into R2 to provide for vegetation clearance for installation, upgrade or replacement of network utilities, and has inserted some thresholds for clearance there. Mr Horn notes PowerCo faces a particular issue with vegetation modification over long distances to maintain electricity distribution lines. Due to the length of these lines, this can result in a large area of vegetation needing to be modified, which often exceeds permitted standards, despite not having more than minor effects. Mr Horn adds that a practical way to manage effects on vegetation clearance from linear infrastructure could be to implement a ratio of clearance based on the length of the infrastructure. I note that Eco R2 permits activities where they comply with one or more of the clauses listed in that rule. Clause B permits any activity if it complies with the vegetation modification limits in standard S1, which allows vegetation to be cleared where it's less than 4 metres high and trunk diameter is less than 30 centimetres, or up to 200 square metres or 10% of a total area. I note while this does not apply the ratio solution sought by Mr Horn, it does permit Indigenous vegetation modification at a reasonably high threshold. I consider this in effect likely provides for the relief sought by Mr Horn. However, if this is not sufficient, I would reconsider that matter.
I think that your discussion with Mr Horn will be invaluable. 200 square metres of vegetation is not a lot over a long distance, especially if it is a large land holding.
Yes, that's exactly right. So, while it may be enough, it may not.
Yeah.
On to section 4.8 for Transpower. The amendment sought to objective 01 and policy P6 to clarify at least no overall loss in Indigenous biodiversity and the effects management hierarchy doesn't apply to the national grid. I'd be interested to hear from Mr. McLeod whether the recommended amendments to policy P6, which includes the exemption for these activities, and the new bespoke policies to manage effects of renewable electricity generation and electricity transmission are sufficient to address Transpower's concerns. Regarding the amendments sought to policy P5, the addition of where practicable in the shape of the policy may go some way to addressing Transpower's concerns. With regard to deleting safety and efficiency, I agree this wording is somewhat redundant as the policy already refers to maintenance and minor upgrading. I therefore agree the wording can be deleted, meaning the new clause would read as shown under paragraph 74. Under section 5, paragraph 75, I've listed the amendments I've recommended to this chapter in the section 42A report. I won't go through all those. Under paragraph 76, I've summarised the amendments that I've recommended as we've talked about this morning. Paragraph 77 is that Ms. Levinson has noted from the section 42A report. And I've provided a brief section 32 AA assessment of the changes we've talked about this morning under paragraph 78. And to summarise under section 6, the main thing that we're going to be discussing here over the next 2 days will be the extent to which it is practicable to give effect to the provisions of the NPSIB for the most part. And I've done a bit of a summary under paragraphs 79 to 82 about the specifics of that. Do we have any further comment, questions?
Just in terms of the list under paragraph 75, given that the summary statements largely focused on the matters that have been contested, are there any particular recommended changes to this topic that you wanted to draw the panel's attention to that we probably won't discuss for submitters?
We probably won't discuss amendments to the introduction. Objectives Eco 01 and 02 solid. The policies are probably going to be the main points of contention. That is where I've recommended most of the changes be made because it's a place where we can align with the direction of the NPSIB without changing the practical rules on the ground too much. And we just kind of, it's where consent is often going to be sought anyway. So then we can manage them on a case-by-case basis a lot more easily via the policies without affecting your average landowner too much. A bit of discussion around the rules and potentially the standards as we've discussed this morning.
Okay, thank you. And the changes in 76 will definitely be to the fore over the next day. Thank you.
I note that we have gone a little over time. I'm sure we'll make it up later. Would we like to take a break now? Because I know, Erica, you're again up for the next show. So just have a wee bit of break. So if we have our morning tea break now, so we'll adjourn for 15 minutes. So we will return at 10:35.